September 23rd, 1942. Muga sector, southeastern approaches to Leningrad. The dawn came late and grey over the torn forests near Muga, the air already heavy with the damp chill that hinted at another Russian winter closing in. And inside a dugout along a muddy tree line, a Red Army tank commander listened to the distant rumble of engines that did not sound like any he had heard before. Senior Lieutenant Ivan Petrov had been awake since before first light, hunched over a map spread across an ammunition crate, tracing with a dirty finger the thin black lines that marked German positions beyond the Sinyavino heights. The siege of Leningrad had ground on for more than a year now, a slow strangulation measured in starvation and artillery fire, and every movement in this sector carried the weight of desperation. Outside, his T-34 crew checked their vehicle in near silence, the familiar clank of tools and the hollow metallic knock of armor plates echoing softly through the trees. Then the sound came again, deeper this time, not the sharp whine of a Panzer III or the rattling growl of a Panzer IV, but a low, heavy thunder that seemed to press down on the earth itself. Petrov stood and stepped outside, his boots sinking into wet soil, and scanned the tree line to the west. The sound was distant, but it carried a confidence that unsettled him, a sense of mass and power moving deliberately rather than urgently. Nearby, crews of KV-1 heavy tanks, once the terror of German panzer formations, paused in their preparations and listened as well. Sergeant Mikhail Sorokin, leaning against the thick slab-sided hull of his tank, frowned and spat into the mud. "That's no tractor," he muttered, half to himself, half to the loader beside him. Too slow, too steady. The Germans, for their part, were advancing cautiously. In the shallow fog beyond the Soviet lines, elements of schwere Panzerabteilung 502 edged forward along a narrow forest road, their brand-new Panzerkampfwagen 6 Ausf E, what the troops were already calling the Tiger, straining against the soft ground. Oberleutnant Hans Kuhn, standing half exposed in the commander's cupola of his tank, felt every vibration through the steel beneath his boots. The machine was enormous, nearly 60 tons of armour and weaponry, and it moved with a deliberate, almost reluctant authority that demanded patience from its crew. Kuhn had been briefed only days earlier. The Tiger was not to be thrown into battle carelessly. Mechanical reliability was still uncertain, the terrain unforgiving, and the enemy stubborn beyond all expectation. But Berlin wanted results, and the Leningrad front, frozen in place for months, offered an opportunity to test the new tank against Soviet armour that had humiliated German forces the year before. Inside the Tiger, the air smelled of oil, hot metal, and nervous sweat. Gunner Unteroffizier Karl Weiss kept his eye pressed to the sight of the 8.8mm KW K-36, his fingers resting lightly on the controls. He had trained on the weapon for weeks, firing at silhouettes and steel plates that shattered under the impact. Today would be different. Today the targets would fire back. As the German column crept forward, Soviet artillery opened up, shells whining overhead and crashing into the forest behind them. The Tiger shuddered as earth and splinters rained down on its hull. Kuhn ducked instinctively, then straightened, forcing himself to remain visible. The armour held. It always did in the tests. On the Soviet side, Petrov's radio crackled with confused reports. Infantry pickets spoke of new tanks, of huge machines moving through the trees. One voice, strained and breathless, insisted that shells had struck a German tank and simply fallen away. Petrov frowned, tapping the side of his headset. Exaggeration was common under fire, especially after a year of siege and loss, but something in the tone gave him pause. "Driver, start up," he ordered. The T-34's diesel engine roared to life, familiar and reassuring. Whatever the Germans had brought forward, it would bleed like everything else. That was what experience had taught them. The first visual contact came suddenly. Through gaps in the trees, Soviet tankers glimpsed a shape that did not fit their expectations. It was taller, broader, its silhouette blocky and almost brutal, with a long gun barrel that seemed absurdly oversized. As Petrov's T-34 rolled into a firing position, he felt a tightness in his chest he could not explain. Target, one tank, bearing 280, his gunner called, already swinging the turret. Range, 800 meters. Fire, Petrov said without hesitation. The 76.2mm gun cracked, the recoil slamming through the turret. Petrov watched through his periscope as the shell struck the German tank squarely on the front. There was a flash of sparks, and then nothing. No smoke, no flame, no visible damage. The shell ricocheted away, spinning into the undergrowth. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. Again, Petrov snapped more sharply than he intended. The second round hit nearly the same spot. Again, sparks. Again, the shell bounced off as if the tank were made of stone. In the distance, Kuhn felt the impacts as dull, heavy knocks, like a hammer striking an anvil. He smiled grimly and keyed his intercom. Enemy tank ahead, armor holding, return fire. Weiss adjusted his aim with clinical calm. The Tiger's gun spoke, a deep, thunderous report that dwarfed the Soviet weapon. Through his sight, Weiss saw the T-34's turret erupt in flame, the tank lurching to a halt as black smoke poured from its hatches. Across the line, disbelief spread faster than fear. KV-1 crews, confident in their own thick armor, opened fire as well, their heavier shells slamming into the Tiger's frontal plate with even greater force. The result was the same: ricochets, sparks, and the sickening realization that nothing they had was working. Sorokin, watching through binoculars from his KV-1, lowered them slowly. "It's not possible," he said, his voice flat. "Nothing shrugs off a KV hit like that." But the impossible was happening, right there in the wet forests outside Leningrad. And as more Tigers edged into view, their guns already searching for targets, the balance of terror that Soviet tankers had relied upon since 1941 began to crack in real time. September 22, 1942. Maga sector, southeastern approaches to Leningrad. The shock of the first exchange had barely faded when the forest erupted into overlapping sounds of battle, engines straining, tracks grinding, and the sharp, frantic chatter of Soviet radios struggling to make sense of what their crews were seeing. Senior Lieutenant Ivan Petrov felt the heat of the burning T-34 wash over his own tank even from a distance, the black smoke rising straight up into the grey sky like a signal flare announcing disaster. He forced his breathing to slow as he swung his periscope from left to right, trying to locate the German tank again. It was still there, advancing with unnerving calm, its turret already slewing toward a second Soviet vehicle that had exposed itself in a desperate attempt to flank. "Load armor-piercing," Petrov ordered, though he knew that was already what they were firing. His loader's hands moved automatically, sweat streaking the grime on his face as he rammed another shell into the breach. The familiar rituals of combat were the only thing holding panic at bay. Nearby, a KV-1 lumbered forward to engage, its thick armor plate scarred from months of fighting but still intact. Lieutenant Alexei Voronin commanded that tank, and he had fought Germans since the first days of the invasion. He had seen panzer crews abandon their vehicles at the sight of KV silhouettes. Now, as he watched the massive German machine absorb hit after hit, a cold unease crept into his gut. "Closer," Voronin said into his throat microphone. "We'll close the range. Aim for the turret ring." The KV-1 advanced, its engine roaring in defiance, closing to 600 meters. Its gun fired, the shell slamming into the Tiger's front with a deafening clang. Voronin leaned forward, straining to see the result. The shell shattered, fragments skittering harmlessly across the German tank's glacis. Inside the Tiger, Oberleutnant Hans Kuhn felt the impact reverberate through the hull, a deeper, heavier strike than the T-34's earlier shots. Still, the armor held. He allowed himself a brief exhale of relief. The designer's promises were proving true under fire. "KV tank," Weiss reported, calm and precise. "Range 600. Frontal." "Engage," Kuhn replied. The Tiger halted, its suspension settling with a heavy groan. Weiss fine-tuned his aim, accounting for the slight elevation and the soft ground. He squeezed the trigger. The 88 fired and the recoil rocked the tank back on its tracks. The shell punched through the KV-1's frontal armor as if it were the thin sheet metal. Inside, the explosion was catastrophic. Voronin never heard the shot that killed him. The KV lurched, flames bursting from vision slits, its turret locking at an unnatural angle as smoke poured out. The tank rolled to a stop, burning fiercely, its reputation as an invincible fortress dying with its crew. Soviet infantry nearby froze, staring in disbelief at the wreck. Some fired their rifles uselessly at the German tanks. Others dropped flat into shell holes as the Tigers supporting Panzer III's and infantry guns opened up, exploiting the chaos. Petrov slammed his fist against the turret wall. "Reverse! Reverse!" he shouted, realizing too late that remaining in place meant certain death. His driver threw the T-34 into reverse, the tank backing away clumsily through churned mud and tree roots. Another T-34 to his right wasn't fast enough. An 88mm round tore through its side armor, igniting fuel and ammunition in a single violent flash. Radio traffic dissolved into overlapping cries and half-finished reports. Words like invulnerable, new heavy tank, and ineffective fire cut through the static. Battalion commanders demanded confirmation, unwilling to accept what they were hearing. Political officers urged calm, insisting the enemy machine could be destroyed like any other with courage and correct tactics. But courage did nothing against physics. From a shallow depression, Sergeant Mikhail Sorokin watched the destruction unfold through the narrow slit of his KV-1's vision block. He felt suddenly very small inside the steel box that had once made him feel untouchable. His gunner looked back at him, eyes wide. "Comrade Sergeant," the gunner said quietly, "our shells." "I know," Sorokin replied, forcing his voice to remain steady. "We keep fighting." He ordered smoke deployed and maneuvered his tank behind a stand of trees, hoping to find a side shot if the German tanks advanced further. It was a thin hope, but it was all he had. On the German side, Kuhn felt the momentum shifting. The Soviet response was disorganized now, their tanks pulling back or burning where they stood. Still, he remained cautious. The terrain was treacherous, the ground uneven and soaked with water. One Tiger ahead of him lurched suddenly as its track slipped, the massive vehicle grinding to a halt at an awkward angle. "Tiger 3 is stuck," came the report over the radio, tension creeping into the voice. Kuhn grimaced. Armor might be impenetrable, but mobility was another matter. Soviet artillery could still kill a stationary tank, no matter how thick its plates. "Cover them," Kuhn ordered. "Infantry forward." As grenadiers advanced cautiously, Soviet artillery finally found its range. Shells began to fall closer, geysers of mud and splinters slamming against the Tiger's hull. One explosion rocked Kuhn's tank hard enough to throw him against the cupola rim. For a moment, the world narrowed to noise and vibration. Petrov, retreating to a new position, watched the German advance slow. He seized on the opportunity. "Artillery! Concentrate fire on the heavy tanks," he shouted into his radio, his voice hoarse. "Aim for tracks! Aim for tracks!" Batteries miles behind the line responded, their guns thundering as shells arced toward the forest. Some fell short, others overshot, but a few landed dangerously close to the Tigers, showering them with debris. One Tiger took a near hit, the blast damaging its running gear and forcing it to stop. Soviet crews cheered briefly, a fragile surge of hope flickering in the smoke. Inside his tank, Kuhn assessed the situation with a professional's eye. The Tiger was proving its worth, but it was not invincible. Not here, not in this ground. He reported the engagement up the chain, carefully noting the enemy's reactions and the limitations revealed by combat. As afternoon light faded and both sides pulled back to regroup, the battlefield fell eerily quiet except for the crackle of burning tanks and the distant thump of artillery. Petrov sat slumped against his turret wall, exhausted, replaying the sight of shells bouncing harmlessly off German armor over and over in his mind. Something fundamental had changed that morning. The rules they had fought by since 1941 no longer applied, and as darkness crept over the forests outside Leningrad, Soviet tankers understood with growing dread that they were facing a new kind of enemy, one that demanded answers they did not yet have. September 22, 1942. Forest south of Miga, Leningrad front. Darkness crept in slowly, seeping through the shattered tree line, as fires from destroyed tanks cast an unsteady orange glow across the churned ground, and the battlefield settled into an uneasy silence broken only by distant artillery and the hiss of cooling metal. Senior Lieutenant Ivan Petrov climbed out of his T-34 as night fully claimed the forest, his legs stiff and trembling as they hit the ground. The smell was overwhelming, burned fuel, scorched paint, and something darker that clung to the back of his throat. He avoided looking too long at the blackened hulks scattered across the clearing, knowing too well that some of them still held men he had trained with, laughed with, eaten frozen rations beside only days earlier. A runner from battalion headquarters found him crouched near the tank's engine deck, hands black with grease and soot. "Comrade Lieutenant," the young soldier said breathlessly, "Command wants a full report, immediately." Petrov nodded and followed, stepping carefully around shell craters still steaming in the cold air. As he walked, fragments of the afternoon replayed in his mind. The sparks flying from the German tank's hull, the sickening ease with which the enemy gun had cut through Soviet armor. None of it fit the lessons he had been taught. In a shallow dugout lit by a single lantern, battalion officers crowded around a makeshift table. Faces were pale, eyes sunken. Maps were marked and remarked, red grease pencil lines smudged by nervous fingers. When Petrov finished his account, the dugout fell quiet. "You're certain the shells struck the front?" asked Major Sergei Kuznetsov, the battalion commander, his voice tight. "Yes, Comrade Major," Petrov replied. "Direct hits. Multiple. No penetration." Kuznetsov exhaled slowly and looked to the political officer standing beside him. The man's expression was rigid, jaw clenched, as if refusing to accept the implications. "This will be reported as an isolated case," the political officer said. "A mechanical anomaly. German propaganda exaggerates such things." Petrov said nothing. He had seen the truth with his own eyes. Out in the forest, recovery teams moved cautiously among the wrecks, listening for movement, for voices, for any sign of life. From the burned-out KV-1, only crackling flames answered them. Sergeant Mikhail Sorokin sat on the ground beside his tank, helmet pushed back, staring into the darkness. His KV-1 was intact, but useless for now, its engine damaged by shrapnel. He had survived, but he felt hollow, as if something vital had been stripped away. A mechanic crouched beside him, shining a dim flashlight into the suspension. "We can get her running by morning," the man said quietly, "if the Germans don't push." Sorokin nodded absently. His thoughts were still on Voronin's tank, on the way it had died so quickly, so completely. For the first time since the war began, he wondered if armor alone could still protect him. Across the no-man's land, German forces were also settling in for the night. The Tigers of schwere Panzerabteilung 502 were pulled back slightly, positioned defensively along firmer ground. Crews worked methodically, despite their exhaustion, checking tracks, tightening bolts, clearing mud from running gear. The victory had been real, but it had come with warnings. Oberleutnant Hans Kuhn climbed down from his tank and stretched his aching back, the cold biting through his uniform. He lit a cigarette, the flame briefly illuminating his face as he watched mechanics swarm over Tiger 3, still stuck and partially disabled. "This terrain will kill us faster than the Russians if we're careless," he muttered to his adjutant. Inside one of the Tigers, Unteroffizier Karl Weiss cleaned his gun in silence, wiping away residue with practiced movements. He had fired accurately, efficiently, yet the images lingered. The sudden eruption of flame, the knowledge that entire crews vanished in an instant because of his actions. He pushed the thoughts aside. Reflection was a luxury for another time. German radio operators relayed after-action reports back to Corps headquarters. The tone was cautious, but confident. Enemy heavy tanks destroyed. Frontal armor resisted all known Soviet tank guns. Mechanical issues noted. Requests made for improved recovery support and clearer terrain for future operations. The significance of what had occurred was not lost on the German command, even if they avoided overconfidence. The Tiger had done exactly what it was designed to do: dominate the battlefield through superior firepower and protection. Yet here, in the swampy forests outside Leningrad, its weaknesses were also apparent. As midnight approached, Soviet artillery resumed sporadic fire, probing rather than pounding. Shells burst harmlessly in the distance, or sent showers of dirt raining down on both sides. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by the crackle of flames and the occasional shout. Petrov lay inside his tank, wrapped in his greatcoat, staring at the steel ceiling inches above his face. He thought of home, of Leningrad itself, starving just beyond the horizon, and of how this new German tank threatened to make an already desperate situation even worse. Tomorrow, he knew, they would face it again, armed with the same guns that had failed them today. Sorokin, too, lay awake, listening to the forest. He replayed the order he had given, to keep fighting, wondering if stubbornness was still bravery or if it had become folly in the face of this new enemy. On the German side, Kuhn finally allowed himself to sleep, though lightly, his boots still on. His last thought before drifting off was a professional one. The Tiger worked, but the Russians would adapt. They always did. Above the battlefield, clouds parted briefly, revealing a cold scattering of stars. Beneath them lay the smoking evidence of a day that had quietly altered the balance of armoured warfare on the Eastern Front, even if neither side yet fully understood how profound that change would be. September 23rd, 1942. Maga Sector, Leningrad Front. Morning arrived under a low ceiling of clouds, the forest soaked with dew and smoke. And as engines coughed to life on both sides of the line, it was clear that whatever shock the previous day had delivered, the fighting was far from over. Senior Lieutenant Ivan Petrov received his new orders just after first light. They were brief, almost brutally so: probe German positions, identify the new heavy tanks, and report any vulnerabilities. There was no mention of reinforcements, no promise of new weapons. He folded the paper and slipped it into his jacket, feeling the weight of responsibility settle onto his shoulders. His T-34 rolled forward cautiously, accompanied by infantry advancing in short rushes, rifles clutched close. The ground was worse than the day before, churned into a sucking mire by tracks and shell fire. Visibility was limited to a few hundred meters at best, trees and smoke conspiring to hide what lay ahead. From a shallow ridge, Petrov spotted movement. A Tiger, unmistakable in its bulk, was edging forward, flanked by German infantry and lighter tanks. It moved slowly, almost arrogantly, its turrets scanning with measured confidence. "Hold fire," Petrov ordered. "Let it pass." The T-34 lay still, engine idling, as the German tank rumbled by at a distance of 300 meters. Petrov's heart pounded. This close, the Tiger seemed unreal, a moving fortress. He noted the overlapping road wheels, the thickness of the armor plates, the sheer length of the gun. He also noticed something else. The Tiger's sides, though thick, were flatter, less angled than its front. He keyed his radio. "Command, this is Petrov." Tiger tank observed. Frontal armor impervious. Side armor appears less sloped. Possible vulnerability at close range. The reply was delayed, static filled, but it came. "Understood. Continue observation. Elsewhere." Sergeant Mikhail Sorokin maneuvered his repaired KV-1 into a concealed position near a bend in the forest road. He had chosen the spot carefully, where trees forced any large vehicle to slow and turn. His crew was tense but focused, every man aware that a frontal duel meant death. "Wait for the side," Sorokin said quietly. No heroics. The German advance resumed cautiously. Oberleutnant Hans Kuhn rode with his hatch open, eyes scanning for ambush. The previous day's engagement had taught him respect for Soviet artillery and terrain, if not their tanks. He knew they were watching, learning. A sudden crack echoed through the forest as Soviet artillery opened up again. Shells bursting closer this time. Kuhn ordered his tanks to spread out, minimizing the risk of multiple vehicles being immobilized. One Tiger veered slightly off the road, its tracks grinding against tree roots, struggling to maintain momentum. That was when Sorokin struck. At less than 200 meters, his KV-1 fired. The shell hit the Tiger's side with a sharp metallic scream. For an instant, Sorokin dared to hope. The impact left a visible scar, a gouge in the armor, but no penetration. Again, he shouted. The second shot hit nearly the same spot. This time, something changed. The Tiger shuddered, smoke puffing briefly from a damaged vision port. The tank halted, turrets swinging wildly as its crew tried to locate the attacker. Inside the Tiger, alarms rang and voices overlapped. Kuhn heard the report over the radio and swore. Side hit, possible damage, came the call. Vehicle halted. Kuhn redirected fire immediately. An 88mm shell smashed into the tree line, shredding Sorokin's position. The blast rocked the KV-1, throwing the gunner against his seat. Splinters and dirt poured in through open hatches. Sorokin ordered a retreat, his hands shaking as the KV lurched backward, disappearing into cover. He had not destroyed the Tiger, but he had proven something critical. It could be hurt. Petrov watched the exchange from his vantage point, committing every detail to memory. This was no longer about bravado or doctrine. It was about adaptation, about surviving long enough to find the cracks in German steel. The skirmish ended as abruptly as it began, both sides pulling back once more. Smoke hung low over the forest, and the ground bore fresh scars. Petrov sent his report, more detailed this time, emphasizing close-range side engagements and coordinated artillery fire. As he shut off his engine and listened to the ticking of cooling metal, Petrov felt a grim resolve take hold. The Tiger was terrifying, yes, but it was not a god. It was a machine, and machines could be broken. On the German side, Kuhn gathered his officers around a map, his finger tracing the narrow roads and wooded choke points. The Russians are watching us closely, he said. They're looking for our weaknesses. From now on, no lone advances. Infantry screens at all times. Both sides were learning, and each lesson was paid for in blood and steel. As the day wore on, and the guns fell silent once more, it became clear that the battles outside Leningrad were entering a new, deadlier phase, one defined not by shock alone, but by the relentless race to adapt before the enemy did. September 24th, 1942. Forward command post near Muga, Leningrad front. Rain fell steadily on the canvas roof of the command bunker, drumming like distant machine gun fire, as senior officers crowded around a scarred wooden table, their boots leaving trails of mud on the planks beneath them. Senior Lieutenant Ivan Petrov stood at attention, fatigue etched deep into his face as he delivered his account for the third time that morning. Each retelling felt heavier, not because the facts were unclear, but because of what they implied. Maps were spread before him, marked with the positions where Tigers had appeared, where Soviet tanks had died, and where, in rare moments, German armour had been forced to halt. Frontal fire ineffective at all observed ranges, Petrov said evenly. Side armour damaged at close distance, but penetration uncertain. Artillery near misses may disable tracks. The room was silent when he finished. Major Sergei Kuznetsov rubbed his temples, eyes fixed on the map. Across from him, a colonel from front headquarters listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. "These reports will go to Moscow," the colonel said at last. Word for word. The weight of that statement settled over the room. Moscow meant scrutiny, urgency, and consequences. It also meant that denial was no longer an option. Out on the line, Sergeant Mikhail Sorokin and his KV-1 crew waited in a shallow hold-down position, the rain turning the surrounding earth into a grey slurry. They had not fired a shot since the morning skirmish, but the tension was constant. Every creak of a tree, every distant engine noise set nerves on edge. "Do you think they'll come again today?" the loader asked quietly. Sorokin shrugged. "They always come." He found himself studying his tank with new eyes, no longer seeing an invulnerable shield, but a tool with limits. He ran a gloved hand over the scar left by shrapnel on the turret, and wondered how long before those limits caught up with him. Across the forest, German crews were also absorbing lessons. Oberleutnant Hans Kuhn stood beside his Tiger, rain streaking down the armor plates, listening as a mechanic explained the damage from the previous day's side hit. "Vision block cracked, sir," the mechanic said. "No penetration, but it shook the crew badly." Kuhn nodded. "And the track?" "Still serviceable. Lucky." Lucky. Kuhn turned the word over in his mind. He had been trained to trust in planning, in engineering, in discipline. Luck had no place in doctrine, yet here it was, asserting itself in the mud and rain of Russia. German radio traffic increased as reports flowed upward. The Tiger's performance was praised, but the tone was no longer triumphant. Terrain, logistics, and mechanical strain featured prominently. The tank was powerful, yes, but it demanded careful handling, especially against an enemy that was clearly taking notes. By midday, Soviet artillery resumed its probing fire, shells crashing into the forest edges and road junctions the Germans relied upon. Kuhn ordered his Tigers to remain under cover, unwilling to risk immobilization for marginal gains. Petrov returned to his unit in the afternoon, carrying with him not only orders, but a sense that something larger was unfolding. The Tiger was no longer just a battlefield anomaly, it was becoming a strategic problem. He gathered his crew and spoke plainly. "We can't fight it head-on," he said. "We survive by thinking, not charging." His gunner nodded silently. The loader stared at the floor. The driver looked straight ahead, jaw clenched. As dusk fell, the rain finally eased, leaving the forest wrapped in mist. Fires burned low, and both sides took stock of their losses. The Tigers remained few in number, but their presence loomed large, warping every plan, every movement. In Moscow, far from the mud and smoke, reports from Leningrad began to stack on desks, their implications rippling outward. New weapons would be needed, new tactics. Time, however, was something the city under siege could ill afford. On the ground near Muga, Petrov lay awake once more inside his tank, listening to the drip of water from the hull. He no longer wondered if the Tiger could be beaten. He wondered how many would die before the answer was found. September 26, 1942. Sinyavino Heights, Leningrad front. A cold wind swept across the ridgeline at first light, carrying with it the dull echo of distant guns, and below the heights the forest lay bruised and scarred, a patchwork of churned earth, shattered trees, and the black skeletons of burned-out tanks. Senior Lieutenant Ivan Petrov watched the landscape through binoculars, his breath fogging the lenses as he exhaled slowly. 2 days had passed since his report went up the chain, and the pause in large-scale fighting felt less like relief and more like the quiet before another blow. Orders had arrived in fragments. Improvise ambushes, coordinate with artillery, avoid frontal engagements at all costs. It was an admission, unspoken but unmistakable, that the Red Army's standard methods no longer worked against what the Germans had unleashed. Petrov's T-34 was positioned in a shallow ravine, its hull concealed by netting and branches hastily dragged into place. Nearby, infantry squads dug in with anti-tank rifles and bundles of grenades, their young faces tight with fear and determination. No one spoke of destroying a Tiger outright anymore. The goal was simpler and darker. Stop it, cripple it, buy time. To the east, Sergeant Mikhail Sorokin prepared his KV-1 for another day of waiting. His crew had been issued additional high-explosive shells, along with instructions that bordered on desperation. Fire at tracks, fire at suspension, Fire until the gun overheats if necessary. Sorokin read the order twice, then folded it and tucked it into his jacket. They want us to blind a bear with pebbles, his gunner muttered. Sorokin said nothing. He understood the reasoning. If the tiger could not be killed, it could at least be pinned, fixed in place long enough for artillery or air support to finish the job. It was a dangerous gamble, but it was all they had. Mid-morning brought movement. German infantry advanced cautiously along the forest road, probing with patrols and mortar fire. Behind them came the Tigers, spaced farther apart now, their advance deliberate and methodical. Oberleutnant Hans Kuhn stood in his cupola, scanning the tree line with a practiced eye. The Soviets were quieter than before. That worried him more than open resistance. "Something's different," Kuhn said into the intercom. "They're letting us come forward." Inside the turret, Unteroffizier Karl Weiss adjusted his grip on the gun controls. He had learned to trust Kuhn's instincts. The Tiger's armor made him feel powerful, but not reckless. He remembered the side hit, the jolt that had rattled his teeth, and he knew the Russians were hunting for a repeat. As the lead Tiger crested a slight rise, the forest erupted. Artillery shells slammed into the road ahead and behind, throwing up walls of earth and smoke. Anti-tank rifles cracked from concealed positions, their bullets useless against armor but deadly to exposed infantry. Petrov waited, counting seconds, heart hammering in his chest. "Now," he said quietly. The T-34 surged forward from concealment, engine roaring as it raced toward the German column's flank. Petrov's gunner fired at a Tiger's track at barely 300 meters. The shell struck low, detonating against the suspension. Metal twisted, and the massive tank lurched violently, one side sagging as a road wheel shattered. Inside the Tiger, Kuhn was thrown against the cupola rim as the tank ground to a halt. Warning lights flared. "Track damaged," the driver shouted. "We're stuck!" Smoke grenades burst around the immobilized tank as German infantry rushed to secure the perimeter. Kuhn forced himself to remain calm. This was exactly what he had feared. Sorokin's KV-1 joined the attack from another angle, firing high-explosive rounds at the same Tiger's running gear. One shell detonated against the rear, further mangling the track assembly. The Tiger was now a stationary fortress, its guns still lethal, but its ability to maneuver gone. Weiss fired back relentlessly, the 88mm gun roaring as it tore through trees and earth. A Soviet anti-tank gun vanished in a spray of splinters and blood. A T-34 that lingered too long in the open exploded under a direct hit, its turret blown askew like a child's toy. Petrov pulled back, knowing better than to press his luck. He had achieved his objective. The Tiger was alive, but pinned. German artillery responded swiftly, shells crashing into Soviet positions with brutal accuracy. The forest shook, branches raining down as explosions chewed into the earth. Infantry casualties mounted, and screams cut through the smoke. Kuhn radioed for recovery vehicles, his voice tight with urgency. Tiger immobilized. Immediate assistance required. The reply came back with unwelcome news. Recovery units were hours away, and Soviet artillery was ranging in. "Hold position," Kuhn ordered his crew. "We fight where we stand." Gunners tried repeatedly to exploit its exposed sides, creeping closer under cover of smoke. German infantry countered with machine gun fire and grenades, the air thick with cordite and fear. Petrov coordinated with artillery observers, calling in fire on the trapped tank. Several shells landed dangerously close, rocking the Tiger and showering it with debris. One explosion collapsed part of the engine deck, igniting a brief fire that the crew extinguished in seconds. As evening approached, German forces finally managed to tow the crippled Tiger back under cover, leaving behind a field littered with bodies and wreckage. The Soviets did not cheer. Too many of their own lay dead for that. Sorokin climbed out of his KV-1 at dusk, legs numb, ears ringing. He looked toward where the Tiger had been, now just a churned scar in the earth. "It bleeds," he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. "Slowly, but it bleeds." Petrov returned to his position, exhausted, but grimly satisfied. They had not destroyed the Tiger, but they had forced it to retreat. had proven that it could be stopped with coordination and sacrifice. It was a small victory, measured not in captured ground, but in hard-earned knowledge. On the German side, Kuhn filed his report late into the night, noting the effectiveness of Soviet track targeting and ambush tactics. The Tiger remained superior in a duel, but the battlefield was no longer a place for duels alone. As night closed in over the Signavino Heights, both sides understood the same truth. The era of shock was ending. What followed would be a brutal contest of adaptation, where every lesson learned would be paid for in blood, and survival would depend on who learned faster. September 28, 1942, eastern edge of the Signavino Forest, Leningrad front. A pale morning light filtered through low-hanging fog, dulling the colours of the forest and turning every sound into something closer and heavier, as if the air itself were pressing down on the men waiting in silence. Senior Lieutenant Ivan Petrov sat inside his T-34 with the engine off, listening to the distant creak of trees swaying in the wind. He had slept barely 2 hours, his dreams fractured by the memory of steel monsters emerging from the mist. Around him, his crew moved with quiet efficiency, checking fittings, reloading ammunition, saying little. No one joked anymore. The Tiger had changed that. Word of the engagements had spread along the front faster than any official communiqué. Tank crews whispered about shells bouncing off German armour, about KV-1s dying in seconds, about the sound of the 88mm gun that arrived before the explosion did. Even infantrymen, hardened by months of siege warfare, spoke of the Tiger in lowered voices, as if naming it too loudly might summon it. Petrov received orders shortly after dawn. German armour was expected to probe the Soviet line again, testing whether the previous ambush had been a fluke. His unit was to hold, delay, and report. Destroying the enemy was secondary to survival. He closed his eyes briefly before passing the orders to his crew. "Remember," he said, forcing calm into his voice, "we fight smart. No glory." To the west, Oberleutnant Hans Kuhn studied the same forest from the opposite side, binoculars raised. His Tigers were fewer now, one still undergoing repairs, another reassigned to rear security. The machine that had seemed unstoppable days earlier was proving vulnerable in ways the manuals had not fully prepared him for. "Keep distance," Kuhn ordered over the radio. "Do not advance without infantry clearance." Unteroffizier Karl Weiss felt the tension in every movement of the tank. The Tiger's engine growled steadily, but the sense of invulnerability was gone. He scanned constantly, searching for flashes, shadows, anything out of place. The Russians were no longer charging blindly, they were hunting. The first shots came from Soviet artillery, shells falling wide but close enough to remind the Germans they were under constant observation. Kuhn ordered a halt, unwilling to risk another immobilized tank. Infantry fanned out, rifles and machine guns at the ready. From his concealed position, Petrov watched the German column hesitate. He felt a strange mix of fear and grim satisfaction. They were afraid now too. "Hold," he whispered, even as his gunner tensed beside him. A T-34 on Petrov's left fired prematurely, its shell streaking toward a Tiger's frontal armour and exploding in a useless shower of sparks. The Tiger responded instantly. Its gun roared, and the Soviet tank vanished in fire and smoke. Petrov flinched despite himself. Discipline was everything now, and one mistake meant death. German infantry advanced cautiously, grenades ready, while the Tigers covered them from behind. The forest became a maze of movement and sound, shouting men, snapping branches, the metallic clatter of tracks grinding slowly forward. Sergeant Mikhail Sorokin waited deeper in the woods with his KV-1, sweat trickling down his spine despite the cold. His orders were unchanged. Ambush, damage, withdraw. His gunner whispered a prayer under his breath. When a Tiger finally exposed its side at the edge of a clearing, Sorokin gave the order. The KV fired, the shell slamming into the German tank's flank. The impact shook the Tiger but failed to penetrate. Still, it was enough to draw fire. The 88 answered with devastating speed. The blast tore through the trees around Sorokin's position, splinters slicing into the KV's armour. One fragment punched through an open vision slit, killing the loader instantly. Sorokin shouted, his voice breaking, and ordered a retreat. The KV reversed blindly, engines screaming as it disappeared into the forest. Sorokin did not look back. He could not. Petrov watched the exchange from afar, helpless to intervene. The price of every lesson was becoming unbearable. By midday, both sides disengaged again. The forest littered with fresh scars and bodies hastily dragged into cover. No ground had changed hands. Nothing decisive had been achieved. Yet something intangible had shifted. The tiger was no longer just a weapon. It was a psychological presence, reshaping how Soviet crews thought, how they moved, how they slept. Confidence, once rooted in the strength of their own armor, was giving way to caution, then to fear. Petrov gathered his men as evening fell. He said nothing about victory or duty. He spoke only of survival. "We learn," he told them quietly, "or we die." Across the line, Kuhn stood beside his tank as the sun dipped below the trees, casting long shadows over the battlefield. He had won again, but it felt hollow. The Russians were adapting, and every encounter grew more dangerous. As darkness settled over the Sinyavino forest, fear replaced certainty on both sides of the line, and the war of steel outside Leningrad entered a colder, more calculated phase, where belief in invincibility, German or Soviet, had no place left to hide. October 1st, 1942. Leningrad Front, Headquarters, Volkhov River Sector. The chill of early autumn crept through the log walls of the headquarters bunker as a courier laid a stack of stamped reports on the long table, the red wax seals already cracked and smeared by hurried hands. Senior officers leaned in as if the papers themselves radiated danger. These were no longer field rumours or fragmented after-action notes. They were confirmed combat reports, signed by battalion and brigade commanders, all describing the same phenomenon in stark, technical language. A new German heavy tank, immune to standard frontal fire, capable of destroying Soviet armour at ranges previously considered safe. General Leonid Govorov read in silence, his lined face betraying little. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, but edged with urgency. "This is not an isolated machine," he said. "This is a doctrine." Orders were issued before the ink on the reports had dried. Additional reconnaissance was authorized. Tank brigades were instructed to avoid direct engagements unless conditions were favorable. Artillery commanders were told to prioritize heavy armor targets, regardless of ammunition expenditure. And in a message sent directly to Moscow, Govorov summarized the situation in a single sentence. German heavy tanks represent a serious threat requiring immediate countermeasures. On the line, Senior Lieutenant Ivan Petrov felt the change almost immediately. New instructions arrived, more detailed than before, outlining specific engagement distances, preferred angles, and coordination protocols with artillery and infantry. It was the first time since the Tiger's appearance that Petrov sensed something resembling control returning to the chaos. "They're listening," his gunner said quietly, scanning the paper. Petrov nodded. They have to, yet listening did not mean relief. That same afternoon, German armor probed again, cautiously but relentlessly. Petrov's unit was ordered to shadow the movement, not engage unless an opportunity presented itself. It was a delicate dance, one misstep away from catastrophe. From a ridgeline, Petrov watched two Tigers advance along a forest track, their turrets sweeping methodically. The tanks moved like predators that knew their strength but respected the terrain. German infantry followed closely, rifles at the ready. Inside the lead Tiger, Oberleutnant Hans Kuhn was acutely aware of the scrutiny. He had received word that higher command was paying close attention to his battalion's performance. The Tiger had proven itself, but expectations were now dangerously high. "Maintain spacing," Kuhn ordered. "No unnecessary exposure." Unteroffizier Karl Weiss tracked a suspected Soviet position through his sight, finger hovering near the trigger. He felt the weight of every shot now, knowing that each engagement taught the enemy something new. The Soviets struck not with tanks, but with artillery, Heavy shells began to fall around the German column, not random this time, but bracketed and deliberate. One Tiger rocked violently as a shell detonated near its left track, bending metal and jamming a road wheel. Damage, but mobile, came the report. Strained but controlled. Petrov seized the moment. He ordered a brief advance, his T-34 darting from cover to fire at the damaged Tiger's side. The shot struck low, exploding against the suspension and forcing the German tank to halt. Almost instantly, return fire tore through the position Petrov had just vacated. The ground he had occupied vanished in a geyser of dirt and fire. He felt the concussion through his chest even from a distance. "Pull back," he ordered, pulse racing. That's enough. The exchange lasted minutes, but it left behind another immobilized Tiger and 2 destroyed Soviet tanks. There was no celebration on either side. The cost was too high, the outcome too uncertain. That evening, Petrov learned that his reports had been forwarded again, this time to armoured design bureaus far from the front. Engineers wanted specifics, angles, distances, shell types. The war outside Leningrad was now shaping decisions in factories hundreds of kilometers away. Sergeant Mikhail Sorokin received quieter news. His KV-1 would be rotated out of the line for repairs and crew replacement. He stood beside the tank as mechanics prepared it for transport, his hand resting on the scarred armour. "She saved us," he said softly, thinking of the loader they had buried the day before. Night fell early, the sky heavy with clouds. In Moscow, officials pored over diagrams and ballistic tables. On the front, men like Petrov prepared to face the Tiger again, armed with slightly better knowledge and the same gnawing fear. The German heavy tank had announced itself with steel and fire, and now the entire Soviet war machine was beginning to turn its attention toward the problem it posed, knowing that the next answers would not come quickly enough for the men already in its path. October 4th, 1942. Forward defensive line near the Sinyavino marshes, Leningrad front. A thin crust of ice clung to puddles along the forest road as dawn broke, the first true warning that winter was no longer approaching, but arriving, and with it came a new strain on men and machines already pushed to their limits. Senior Lieutenant Ivan Petrov stood beside his T-34, watching exhaust vapour curl into the cold air. The tank's engine had protested that morning, coughing and sputtering before finally settling into an uneven idle. Mechanics moved between vehicles, hands numb, tools slipping from gloved fingers. Cold made everything harder. Metal brittle, oil thick, nerves frayed. Orders had arrived overnight. German heavy tanks were expected to attempt a limited breakthrough toward the marsh crossings. Petrov's unit was to delay, not stop, the advance. Time, once again, was the most precious commodity. He climbed into the turret and closed the hatch, the familiar claustrophobic darkness closing around him. The radio crackled with terse updates. Infantry had made contact. German armour was moving. Across the line, Oberleutnant Hans Kuhn felt the cold just as keenly. His Tiger's engine growled reluctantly. Each vibration transmitted through the hull like a warning. The tank was powerful, but it was not immune to the Russian climate. Lubricants thickened, components strained, and every kilometre of movement demanded care. "We move slow," Kuhn ordered. "No breakdowns." Unteroffizier Karl Weiss nodded, eyes fixed on the sight. He had learned to read the terrain now, to anticipate where the Russians might hide. Marshland, narrow roads, wooded choke points. Every feature was a potential trap. The engagement began without fanfare. Soviet artillery opened up, shells walking across the German advance route, forcing the Tigers to halt and adjust. Petrov listened as the ground trembled, counting the seconds between impacts, gauging how close they were landing. "Advance by bounds," he ordered when the shelling lifted. His T-34 surged forward briefly, fired a single round at a Tiger's flank from extreme range, then withdrew. The shot did nothing, but that was not the point. It forced the Germans to react, to slow, to deploy infantry. German return fire was immediate and overwhelming. The 88mm guns thundered, blasting apart trees and sending shockwaves through the earth. A Soviet anti-tank gun vanished in a cloud of splinters. Petrov felt the concussive force even inside his tank, teeth rattling. To his right, another T-34 was less fortunate. It lingered too long after firing, its retreat delayed by soft ground. Weiss's gun found it with brutal efficiency. The shell struck the turret ring, and the tank erupted, the explosion briefly illuminating the forest like a flare. Petrov swallowed hard and kept moving. There was no time to mourn. As the day wore on, the pattern repeated. Soviet forces harassed, withdrew, repositioned. German tanks advanced meters at a time. Their progress measured not in kilometers, but in lives and machines consumed. The Tigers were still dominant in direct engagements, but they were slower now, burdened by caution and by the environment itself. One Tiger bogged down near the marsh edge, its weight sinking into treacherous ground. Kuhn diverted infantry and engineers to free it, but the delay was costly. Soviet artillery zeroed in, shells crashing down with increasing accuracy. Inside the stuck Tiger, the crew worked frantically, engine revving as tracks spun uselessly. Mud sprayed against the hull, freezing almost instantly. Weiss felt sweat run down his back despite the cold. "Get us out," Kuhn snapped over the intercom. Though he knew there were no easy answers, a shell detonated nearby, stunning the crew and knocking out the radio for precious minutes. When communication was restored, Kuhn made the decision he had dreaded. "Abandon recovery," he ordered. "Destroy sensitive equipment and withdraw." The Tiger was not destroyed, but it was left behind, partially immobilized, a steel monument to the limits of even the most powerful machine. Soviet infantry would later creep close under cover of darkness, studying it, touching its armor, with a mix of awe and hatred. By late afternoon, the German advance stalled. They had gained ground, but at a pace far slower than planned. Kuhn filed another report, this one more sober than any before. The Tiger could dominate a battlefield, but it could not conquer terrain, weather, and an adapting enemy alone. Petrov received confirmation that the line had held long enough. Reserves were moving. The immediate crisis had passed. He leaned back against the turret wall, exhaustion washing over him. As darkness fell and temperatures dropped further, both sides dug in once more. Fires were kept low, engines covered, weapons cleaned with stiff fingers. The war outside Leningrad had become a test, not just of steel, but of endurance. The Tiger still inspired fear, but it now carried weight, literal and symbolic, that slowed it down. And in that growing gap between power and practicality, the Soviets saw the faint outline of a future where the monster could be contained, if not yet slain. October 7th, 1942. Abandoned Tiger position near the Sinyavino marshes, Leningrad front. The morning fog clung low to the ground, muffling sound and shrinking the world to a few dozen meters as Soviet infantry crept forward with rifles raised, eyes fixed on the dark angular shape looming out of the mist ahead. Senior Lieutenant Ivan Petrov arrived moments later, dismounting from his T-34 and advancing on foot. Before him stood the immobilized Tiger, its massive hull half sunk into frozen mud, tracks twisted and clogged. For the first time, he was seeing one up close, not through smoke and fear, but in stillness. The tank radiated menace even in silence. Its armor plates were scarred and blackened, pitted where shells had struck and failed. Petrov reached out despite himself, brushing his gloved hand against the steel. It felt impossibly thick, cold enough to bite. Around him, soldiers moved cautiously, some circling wide, others peering into vision slits and open hatches. No shots rang out. The crew had withdrawn during the night, leaving the machine behind like a shed skin. "Look at this," an engineer called softly. Petrov joined him at the side of the hull, where multiple impacts clustered around the suspension. Close-range hits, some from high-explosive shells, others from armor-piercing rounds. None had penetrated, but the damage was clear. Road wheels shattered, track links bent and cracked. They aimed for movement, the engineer said. Smart. Petrov nodded. They learned the same lesson we did. Word spread quickly. Officers, mechanics, and intelligence men were summoned. Measurements were taken. Sketches drawn. Thickness gauged as best as possible with improvised tools. Every detail was recorded. From the angle of the armor plates to the mounting of the 88 mm gun, for the men gathered there, this was more than a captured position. It was a glimpse inside the enemy's advantage. Sergeant Mikhail Sorokin arrived later that morning, his expression tight as he stared at the Tiger. He had lost a crewman to this machine. Seeing it inert stirred something bitter in his chest. So this is it, he said quietly, the thing that made us doubt ourselves. Petrov looked at him. It's just steel. Sorokin shook his head. Steel that kills. German artillery fire eventually forced the Soviets to pull back, but the damage was done. Observations, sketches, and impressions were already on their way to headquarters. Engineers would study them. Designers would argue over them. Somewhere far behind the lines, drawing boards would be adjusted. Across the front, Oberleutnant Hans Kuhn learned that the abandoned Tiger had been examined by the enemy. The news hit him harder than losing the tank itself. Knowledge was a weapon, and he had just handed it to his adversary. They'll adapt faster now, he said to Weiss that evening, staring into a small fire. We won't surprise them again. Weiss said nothing. He had come to the same conclusion days earlier. As night fell over the marshes, Petrov returned to his unit with a strange sense of clarity. The Tiger was no longer an unknowable terror. It had dimensions, weaknesses, limits. It could be studied, planned against, countered over time. Fear did not vanish, but it changed shape. It became sharper, more focused, stripped of mystery. The monster outside Leningrad was still deadly, still dominant in the open, but it had been touched, measured, and understood just enough to prove that it belonged to the same brutal world as every other weapon of war. October 10th, 1942. Frontline trench line near Muga, Leningrad front. A hard frost coated the ground in white as dawn broke, crunching under boots and tracks alike, and the men huddled in their positions breathed clouds of vapor into the still air, waiting for a sound they now recognized instantly. Senior Lieutenant Ivan Petrov stood at the edge of a trench, binoculars raised, scanning the forest where the trees thinned toward the German side. The line had stabilized for the moment. No Tigers were advancing today, yet their absence was almost worse than their presence. Every creak of ice, every distant engine noise tightened nerves already stretched thin. In the days since the immobilized Tiger had been examined, something subtle but powerful had spread along the Soviet lines. The tank was no longer just an enemy machine. It had become a story. New crews arriving at the front asked about it immediately. Veterans answered in low voices, describing shells bouncing away, KV-1s dying in a single hit, the thunder of the 88 that came before the explosion. The Tiger had acquired a reputation independent of its actual numbers, magnified by fear, repetition, and the brutal lessons learned too late. Petrov heard the stories too, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes distorted, but always rooted in truth. He corrected what he could, emphasizing tactics, angles, coordination. Still, he knew morale was changing. Confidence was no longer assumed. It had to be earned, every day. Sergeant Mikhail Sorokin sat on an ammunition crate nearby, staring into the distance. His KV-1 was gone now, sent to the rear, and he had been temporarily reassigned while waiting for a new crew and machine. He felt unmoored without the familiar steel around him. They talk about it like it's invincible, he said quietly, not looking at Petrov. It isn't, Petrov replied, but it makes mistakes fewer times than we do. On the German side of the line, Oberleutnant Hans Kuhn listened to his own crew's talk in subdued tones. The Tiger was still respected, still feared by the enemy, but the early confidence had faded. Men spoke more often about mud, cold, breakdowns, artillery brackets, about how close the Russians were getting. Kuhn gathered his platoon leaders that afternoon and spoke plainly. "The tiger has done what it was meant to do," he said. "But do not believe the stories. We are not untouchable. Complacency will kill us faster than any Soviet gun." Unteroffizier Karl Weiss nodded, cleaning his optics with slow, careful motions. He had fired fewer rounds in the past week than in the first days of combat, but each shot now carried more weight. Every engagement was deliberate, restrained. The hunt had become mutual. As October wore on, the tigers were used more sparingly, held back for key moments rather than pushed forward indiscriminately. Soviet units, in turn, avoided decisive clashes, favoring delay, harassment, and preparation. The front settled into a grim equilibrium shaped by the presence of a weapon that neither side could ignore. Petrov wrote one final report that month, summarizing what his unit had learned. He ended it simply: "The tiger inspires fear, but fear can be managed with knowledge, discipline, and cooperation." It was not a heroic conclusion, but it was an honest one. That night, as he lay inside his T-34 listening to the distant guns around Leningrad, Petrov reflected on the first time he had seen a shell bounce off the tiger's hull. The disbelief had been paralyzing. Now, disbelief had been replaced by resolve. The tiger had arrived outside Leningrad as a shock, a revelation of German industrial and tactical power. In its wake, it left burned tanks, shaken men, and a legend that would grow far beyond the forests of Magar. But it also left something else behind: hard-earned understanding. And in a war measured in adaptation as much as destruction, that understanding would prove just as decisive in the battles yet to come.